Hey folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for Philosophy 120 Critical Thinking. Today we are looking at the topic of arguments. So there's a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to go over what it is I actually mean when I talk about arguments, as well as why this sort of thing comes up for a critical thinking class, and why we should care about these things. We're then going to talk just a little bit about how arguments, opinions, and beliefs fit together, and look at some of the different tools and things to look out for when we try and identify arguments out in the real world or out in different texts. So, let's get into the basics of all this first. Our focus for today and for a lot of the semester is, as I just said, talking about arguments. And when we talk about arguments in here, we're not talking about the same sort of clashes or fights or discussions that a lot of you are probably familiar with. Because in ordinary English and casual, everyday English, we usually talk about arguments as being some kind of a fight or a confrontation. It's the kind of thing that can only happen between two people, and usually one of them is trying to communicate something or convince the other person's right. And that last point is probably the closest and only relevant bit from that use of the term argument for our purposes. When we talk about arguments in this class, we're actually going to mean something quite different in this case. You see, our sorts of arguments can actually be held alone. For our purposes, an argument is a set of claims where one or more of those claims gives reasons or evidence for another claim, called a conclusion. So effectively, rather than being a disagreement between two people, whoever they may be and whatever they may be arguing about, instead, our sort of argument is simply a set of claims, a set of sentences or ideas or propositions that try and give evidence for some other claim or idea. And so out of this set of statements, we can talk about two main parts of an argument. We can talk about the statements that give reasons, the supporting statements in our set, called the premises, or just the premise, or a premise, if we want to talk about the singular version. And we use those premises to try and support some sort of a conclusion. Those of you who have had composition before or taken various writing classes, think of it like the arguments that you give in an essay supporting a thesis statement. In this case, an argument would be the whole paper that has a thesis statement to it. The conclusion would be the thesis statement itself, the thing that the paper tries to prove, and all of the evidence and little bits that the paper includes in support of that thesis are what we would call the premises. Now, this isn't that unique of a use of the term. It's not as if philosophers and people who study critical thinking are the only ones who use the term argument in this way. You actually see this in all sorts of different places. And even if you've never used the term before or labeled them as such, you've actually dealt with arguments almost every day of your life. It's pretty much guaranteed. In fact, regardless of when you watch this or under what context, I would bet decent amounts of money that you've actually had to deal with at least one argument today, wherever and whenever you are. Oh, future people. Anytime that you're faced with somebody trying to convince you of something, using reasons in particular, you're dealing with somebody who's giving an argument for whatever that position is, or whatever that idea is. And I phrase it this way for a particular reason. The reasons part of an argument is actually rather the distinctive thing about it. You see, this should seem completely obvious to almost all of you, but people can try and convince each other of things through a wide variety of methods. In communication classes, you sometimes talk about the old school elements of rhetoric, the different approaches that you can take, ethos, pathos, and logos, and that sort of thing. Or maybe you just have a lot of experience with salesmen or politicians, or maybe your mother is particularly good at guilt-tripping people, or you've got a friend who is able to pressure you into doing something. And all of these people in all of these different situations, they'll use different sorts of things to try and convince you of those positions. They may try and sway you emotionally. and like the guilt trip sort of method, make you feel a certain way in order to bring you around to their way of thinking. Or maybe they'll simply explain a position, or explain how a couple of different ideas are connected. Or maybe they'll simply describe what they're feeling or seeing or experiencing. Maybe they'll insult you, maybe they'll pull a gun on you, maybe they'll do any number of various things. But arguments in particular are unique because that's when people use reasons to try and sway you towards some position, or you use reasons to try and support some other claim. So, that's the basics of what an argument is, at least as far as our class is concerned. It's a set of claims where some of the claims, called the premises, offer support or reasons or evidence in favor of another claim, called the conclusion, the thing that is trying to be proved in a given situation. Now, our book runs through a number of different examples of these sorts of things, but it's in particular worth noting, and I think the textbook does a rather nice job of this, noting that you can't turn every statement into an argument, or you can't find arguments behind every statement. For example, if you have somebody who's simply explaining something, they may talk about relations between different parts, or like say if you've got someone trying to explain why the sky is blue, they may talk about how photons interact with the atmosphere and how certain wavelengths of light are reflected by all of that, and how different particles there change that color based on the situation and the angle of the sun's at, and all this sort of stuff. None of that whatsoever is involved with arguments, even though they're using scientific reasoning and evidence and all that. They're simply explaining a process rather than using one set of claims to try and convince you of the truth of another one. They're not using one set of claims to support a conclusion. They're simply explaining how different ideas fit together. Similarly, we'll sometimes see conditional statements, statements that have like an if-then sort of structure to them, like if you do your homework, you'll get a good grade in the class. These kind of statements aren't arguments either, even though they look like them and they have the same sort of connection that we often see in arguments. The conditional statements on their own simply describe a relationship. If X is the case, then Y is the case. Conditional statements like this don't actually necessarily say anything about why one of them is connected with the other. They may be two entirely coincidental things. Like, for example, it is an entirely true statement that if the sun is shining, then squares have four corners. This is a conditional statement. It's 100% true, because squares have four corners at all times. It's just a necessary fact about squares. But the statement itself offers no sort of link between them. The fact that the sun is shining does not try and give support for the idea that squares have four corners. So, since there's no sort of rational support between the two parts, it's not true that the conditional statement is actually any sort of argument. So, again, for a lot of you, this probably isn't mind-blowing information. This unit in particular is going to have a lot of vocabulary thrown at you that at times may seem a bit dull and sort of separate to this whole promise of studying critical thinking. So it's worth pausing for a second and actually asking, why do we care about all of this? Why do we care about arguments? Why do we care about identifying them? Why do we care about what a conditional statement is or whatever else? And the basic fact is, arguments are actually at the core of critical thinking, just in general. If you remember back from last time, when we talked about what critical thinking is, at least in brief, we talked about thinking like a philosopher. We talked about trying to get at the fundamental concepts and ideas of something and being able to approach it in a particular way, with a particular sort of attitude that critiques and analyzes how the various basic elements of some problem or topic fit together so that we can better think about it, make judgments, act on it, and so on. So when we look at what ideas are, or when somebody presents us with an idea, it's not enough for us to just look at the statement on its own in a vacuum. separate from everything else that's going on. Instead, we also need to look at why a person believes that particular statement. Because without that why, without understanding the reasons and the support behind the idea, we really don't have a whole lot of a basis for analyzing it or comparing it. I mean, if you imagine a world where no one gave any sort of reasons or support for their positions, they just believed things. They had opinions about stuff and they shared them. They told people what they were, but they never gave reasons for what it is that they believed. How would you actually go about deciding who was right about various things? You might, like, say, have one person who says that the sky is blue, another person who says that it's green today. And if nobody ever explained why they believed things, if they didn't give arguments for their positions, even if they're very basic and simple and obvious ones, like, hey, look, there's the sky. Without that sort of link, without that sort of explanation, we'd have a very difficult time actually discerning who's correct in those sorts of situations. And while the example's a little bit trivial, we face that exact sort of problem, especially with philosophical questions, with things that are not obvious, or questions that have to do with how we should structure and govern our lives. If we can't have the reasons for why a particular position's the case, we're kind of lost when it comes to deciding between various competing positions offered by reasonable people. So when we try and think critically about things, when we try and have this critical attitude that looks at the components of an idea and how it fits together with other things, we need to know the evidence and the reasons behind that claim and whether or not those reasons give us good reasons to believe it. Because at the end of the day, we do want to try and evaluate arguments and ideas. To put it another way and to use another turn of phrase, we also don't want to be philosophical weather vanes to a certain extent. I don't know if everybody has seen the image of a weather vane, like one of the little metal spinny things that when the wind blows, it catches it and turns it to indicate which way the wind's blowing that particular moment. A philosophical weather vane or wind vane is somebody who simply changes their mind based on the last thing they heard. Probably all of you know somebody who's a little bit like this. Somebody who just believes whatever the last thing they heard was, or the last person to talk to them is the one that has the most pull and influence over them. That sort of way of life is not exactly a successful or a functional one. It seems like it would be much better if we actually were able to decide for ourselves what was true, and in some cases, when we're presented with information that doesn't seem to be right, if we're going to be good critical thinkers and responsible citizens of just the world or life or our particular countries, we need to be able to analyze the reasons for a position and decide whether those reasons are good or not, and whether or not they actually support the conclusions and the ideas that were trying to be pushed on us. So studying arguments, even though it's going to be a little bit dull at times, and even though we're going to talk about structures and vocab and a lot of things having to do with claims and sentences and support, even though that may get a little bit dry, effectively what we're doing is we're building a toolkit that's going to allow us to go deeper and more critically into whatever subject we want to talk about. Now, it's also worth taking a moment when we are considering what arguments are and we're laying the groundwork for the rest of the class, that we take a moment and talk about opinions and different positions and how arguments fit into what we usually or often call opinions. A few of you, after hearing me talk about like deciding who's right on certain questions, especially philosophical questions, things that are maybe religious or ethical in nature, that talk about how we're supposed to be living our lives, probably a few of you really like that first claim here on the slide. The idea that, well, what about not judging people? Doesn't everybody have a right to their opinion? And that is 100% true and correct. Everyone does have a right to their own opinion, and it would be foolish to try and disregard that sort of idea. But we ought to be clear about what exactly that sort of idea means. and what it might mean for us as potential critical thinkers or as aspiring critical thinkers. An opinion on its own is a belief that somebody has, and no more, no less. Literally, the word comes from the Latin verb opinare, to think or to believe. So, an opinion is literally just a belief that you have. It's an attitude that we take towards some proposition or claim. I throw out the asterisk because that's a little bit of an open philosophical question, but a lot of epistemologists, people who study knowledge and belief and evidence, agree that a belief is a kind of attitude that we take towards some topic. And in that sense, everything that we know and most things that we deal with as far as claims and ideas that we agree with are opinions by that definition. I have the opinion that the earth is round. Now, it's more than just that. It's not a mere opinion, or it's not just an opinion. I've got facts to back that sort of thing up. There's mathematical measurements that we can show based on the movement of stars and known distances, or the measurements of shadows that we could know that the Earth is round and has a particular circumference. We have historical evidence to back up the idea that the Earth is round. So while I do, by definition, have an opinion that the Earth is round, I've got a belief that that's true, it's not a mere opinion. It's not my belief and nothing else. Instead, it's a supported opinion. It's an opinion that has some amount of evidence and good reasoning and facts behind it to support and count in favor of that opinion being true. So in that sense, it's not the case that all opinions are created equal. Even if everybody has a right to their opinion, that doesn't mean that we ought to automatically treat all opinions as being on a level playing field. Some opinions are good and well supported or well thought out, and some of them simply aren't. And again, this is probably sounding like obvious info for a lot of y'all, but these are things that you pick up a little bit just by living, just by experiencing other people and how they deal with things. But it's still worth saying and pointing out that just because we're trying to be critical thinkers and just because we're trying to deal with and work with the various ideas and claims that people make, and we want to be able to evaluate those, that doesn't mean that we're necessarily judging people in a way that we'd like to normally avoid. And it doesn't mean that we have to give up on thinking critically and for ourselves just because it's true that everyone has a right to their opinion. And in fact, even that idea is probably worth going into a little more detail and being clearer on. When we say that someone has a right to their opinion, we can mean a couple of different things. We could mean the simple idea that I'm allowed to believe different things than you. I'm allowed to believe differently about the world than you do. In that sort of sense of the phrase, I have the right to my own opinion, or I've got a right to an opinion, that's absolutely true, especially in this particular country, in which freedom of speech is a sometimes misunderstood, but very well regarded basic human right for a lot of us. But the other way we might start using the phrase, I have a right to my opinion, or he or she has a right to their opinion, is that we might mean something closer to they can believe whatever they want, and there's nothing wrong with that. And they don't need evidence for that. If they believe it, well then fine, they're entitled to that. And that second sense of saying that somebody has a right to their own opinion is less obviously true than the first. In fact, we might even go so far as to say that that second one is just downright irresponsible. To say that you don't need any sort of evidence for your beliefs, or that just because you have a right to an opinion means that it's perfectly fine for you to believe it, on a personal, individual level, that seems mistaken. As a society, of course, we need to allow and treat everybody as having an absolute right to hold whatever their opinions are. But if we're thinking on the matter of personal well-being and what's good and useful for you as an individual, simply saying that you can believe whatever you want isn't very helpful or useful. It's not something that really allows for us to grow and develop in the ways that we need to as individuals, or excel in our chosen careers, or however we choose to spend our lives. We might also worry about just general rational justification. Just because I have a right to believe that the sky is purple 24/7 doesn't mean that I'm justified in believing so. I'm allowed to. It's permissible. It's perfectly fine and acceptable. There's nothing wrong with it in a moral or a social sense. But rationally speaking, it's probably mistaken, because the last time I checked, the sky had other colors than purple to it. So again, this is probably more detail than we needed on this sort of idea, but I think it's important to stress, at least somewhat, that we don't need to be entirely non-judgmental when it comes to evaluating ideas and arguments. We don't need to hold back from judging whether or not the reasons and evidence given for an idea actually do support it. Just like we don't automatically treat everyone as trustworthy. It's simply just not a wise thing to do in a lot of ways. So, all that being said, all the preliminary work being laid out, here's a little bit of practice for you before we get into the nitty gritty details of the next lecture. Arguments show up in a lot of places. If you haven't noticed from our discussion so far, arguments are a rather general thing. Anytime we talk about an idea or a claim being rationally supported by other claims, whenever we have a conclusion that's supported by premises, we have an argument. And there's a lot of things that aren't arguments, but there are a lot of things that are as well. And so they show up almost everywhere in life. They show up in politics, in news articles, in sales pitches, in your parents' advice, in what your teachers tell you. Even right now, I am giving an argument for the idea that arguments show up in lots of places. I've stated a conclusion, namely, arguments are everywhere, and then I've started giving evidence for that claim. I've started giving reasons for you to believe that arguments show up in lots of places. So, you really can't escape them. They're everywhere in the world, in the wild, so to speak. And the easiest way to spot these is by starting to look for particular indicator words or other clues that show the kind of premise-conclusion relationship that makes an argument what it is. For premises, you can be on the lookout for anywhere that you start seeing the words since, because, for the reason that, given that, follows from, because of, any of these types of words that seem to describe a kind of rational support of a reason for some other idea. These are the kinds of words that indicate that you're dealing with a premise to some argument somewhere. And conclusions, similarly, often have words that signal or indicate that it's what we're working with. Conclusions are often marked by terms like therefore, thus, so, then, as a result, proves that, hence, as a result, in conclusion, to sum up, because of these, anything that seems to indicate that you've reached a conclusion or a final point that's the culmination of the other reasons and ideas given so far, you've got a good clue that you're talking about a conclusion. But it's worth pointing out that it's not always that easy to identify these sorts of things. Take, like, say, the three examples that I've got over here on the right. The first of which is an argument that we see in every logic class ever taught, and almost every philosophy class ever taught at the intro level everywhere in the world. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This is a basic argument, and it's written in this nice, standardized, line-by-line format that makes it easy to read. And we can see a couple of, or at least one of, the kinds of indicator words I was just talking about. Here we have an argument, we have a conclusion, Socrates is mortal, that's supported rationally by a couple of other statements. We have the ideas that all men are mortal, and that Socrates is a man, and together, these two, statements 1 and 2, support, rationally speaking, the idea that Socrates is also mortal. And the therefore is part of what gives all of this away. On the one hand, context gives us a lot of the information here. It's easy to tell that these terms, these claims kind of build on each other to a certain extent. But our nice signal word therefore also shows that some sort of a conclusion is being reached at the end of this thing. Similarly, if we take something that's a little bit different, we might say something like Israel-Palestine relations are complicated. For this reason, you shouldn't say anything about them. You should refrain from talking about Israel and Palestine because it's complicated. This maybe isn't the best argument in the world, and for a lot of you, it's probably not convincing in the least. But not all arguments are good. We'll spend future lessons and future chapters on actually evaluating these things. At the moment, we are literally looking at the utmost basics of dealing with these things. But again, we still have the same sorts of general tendencies that we've talked about before. We have the same sort of context, the same sort of connection between reasons and a conclusion. In fact, we even have a couple of unspoken premises, a couple of hidden reasons for not wanting, for the idea that you shouldn't say things about Israel and Palestine, namely that if a subject is complicated, then you shouldn't talk about it. And that's almost certainly a false premise. It's not true at all. But it's that idea is sort of lurking in here regardless. It's definitely implied by the rest of this. But the context of the discussion, the way that one statement flows and connects to the other, definitely strikes us like an argument. We also have another one of our indicator words, for this reason, that, again, shows that we have a reasons and conclusion, a premise and conclusion relationship going on. But these numbered, standardized line-by-line formats don't show up very often. They often do in philosophy texts, and certainly in this class, where we put a lot of things in this standardized format just to make things easier for us. And we'll talk a little bit how to translate real things over into that in the future. But generally, we seem to something much more like this last line. I really don't think Kanye would be a good president. He seems really full of himself and he does weird things. This is the kind of comment that if you added in more emojis or swear words or genital jokes, you'd probably find somewhere online. It's a very natural sort of comment to make about something that hopefully, in my personal political opinion, doesn't happen. I'm not sure we need many more celebrity presidents. But here we have still another argument that follows the exact same sort of structure as the others, even if it doesn't look quite the same. We have a conclusion given. I really don't think Kanye would be a good president. And this statement's supported by the other things listed right here. The idea that Kanye seems really full of himself and he does weird things. And the unspoken, the hidden premise that if someone is full of himself or if they do weird things, they won't make a good president. This sort of idea supports that initial statement. And so even though we don't have any obvious indicator words going on here, we don't have any obvious sign or format that shows that this is an argument, the context and the connections between statements, when we read it and understand it, show us that this too is an argument and that it has the same sort of relations going on, the same sort of patterns going on in it that we see in the other two. So even though indicator words are useful, they're nice clues for identifying arguments and for labeling premises and conclusions, they're certainly not always there. You can't count on them 100% of the time to be there. Plus, sometimes the words are used in ways that don't indicate arguments. Take one of the indicator words for conclusions, then. The conjunction then often is used as a preposition. It's often used as a way to say, this happened, then this happened. And that sort of thing is really more of a description than it is an argument. None of the statements have the premise-conclusion relationship that we see in general with arguments. And so, since it isn't trying to give rational support for some idea, just because the word's there doesn't mean that it's automatically an argument. So we really have to rely on context and our understanding of what's going on in the text or what people are saying or what they're trying to say. If that sounds a little bit fuzzy and subjective, well, it's not a precise science, this identification, or at least it's not at the level that we're dealing with here. I'm sure we might could try and give a very detailed and rigorous philosophical definition of what this premise conclusion relationship is. But unfortunately, for most of our uses, it's just too vague to go with. So we do have to rely on context a lot. But you guys are experienced, you're intelligent folks, you've made it this far. I imagine that you can do pretty well at identifying this stuff. If you want additional practice, on the one hand, you have an assignment that should help with this. Journal 1 in particular is about finding and identifying arguments out in the real world, finding some video or an article or some thing out in the world that does an argument for something, even if it's a Billy Mays video trying to sell you on OxyClean or something. But Journal 1 will have you try and find an argument out in the real world. And the first part of the homework, the first couple of exercises for Homework 1, which you should start taking a look at as you do the rest of the material for the unit, it also has you go through a few exercises that have you identify premises and conclusions and whether or not an argument is present in this set of statements or not. So, I encourage you to go ahead and try out the homework. If not, though, maybe wait until after the next lecture. Journal 1, I do also highly recommend going ahead and doing after all of this, after you've done this first reading in this first lecture. But you are, of course, free to do whatever you like order-wise as far as the unit goes. It's just suggested that you go with the order listed there on the checklist. In the meantime, though, try those out. Hope you're having a great semester.